please allow me to welcome Stephen Karingi, the Director for Regional Integration and Trade here at ECA, Robert Lesinge, who is the Chief for Energy and Infrastructure Services here at the ECA, and also Jeffrey Manyara from the ECA, and then a brief word will be given to us just to really crystallize our thinking around tourism, a brief word virtually from Walter Mzembe, who's the chairman of the World Tourism Network. He will have the last say. Robert and Stephen, thank you very much for your time. Just the highlights of the research that you've conducted, the numbers that matter and must convince and can convince the business community that transport is the next big thing, and this is where the bankable projects and the rates of return are to be found. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lerato. So, Excellencies, and especially those who are representing our heads of state who are still with us, and all the CEOs, captains of industries that are still with us, and our participants virtually. We've had a lot of engagement virtually, Lerato, by the way, answering a lot of the questions. So, and I've been warned that we are going to compress this session. So let me take only 2 minutes to put things in context before I give the floor to Robert. So if you go to the first slide, to the next slide on this, is to say that, as you know, as you heard from Beatrice, from the AFCFTA Secretariat, a lot of work has been done in the context of the AFCFTA. We all know the implications of the AFCFTA in terms of the catalyzation of intra-African trade. In fact, the work that we have done here at the ECA, we know what is going to happen in terms of intra-African trade growth in services, in goods, and in the area of services where we are focusing on today, we know that most of the growth in the area of intra-African trade in services is actually going to happen in tourism and trade. So essentially the next question we asked ourselves is, how do you translate this into jobs and into investments? And the study that Robert is going to give is to show how the growth in trade in services in those two specific sectors will actually be the platform through which we can actually unlock additional investments in the continent and jobs, because we know the exact corridors where these things are going to happen, where you need extra kilometers of road, where you need new rail track. And so what Robert will be giving us is actually details about that. And so that at least he gives you more insights into this, let me pass the floor now to Robert.
Thank you, Stephen. I think this is very exciting. It has taken us a lot of months to undertake this study. And so we're quite pleased to present the results. Very briefly, I would like to say what we did, how did we do it, and what did we find out. What we did was to ask ourselves, what is the implications of the continental free trade area for the demand of transport infrastructure and services? So basically, what does this mean for roads, rail, airport, railways? What does this mean in terms of the number of trucks, train wagons, airplanes, and vessels, and so on? Now, how did we do it? Pretty technical work. We started by doing a trade model, the gravity model, to see bilateral trade flows between African countries. Once we knew that, we then went on to do transport model. What transport modes would be used to move the trade between the different origin and destination pairs that we identified from the trade model. Once we knew the transport modes that would be used, the quantity, we were then able to quantify the freight for roads, for rail, for air, for ship. And once we knew that, we could calculate the number of trucks, the number of rail wagons, the number of airplanes, the number of vessels. And once we know that, and we know the unit cost of different drugs, aircraft, we could put numbers on what we are looking at. So what did we find out? For roads, and I can see some charts on the screen, which is very small. We look at the baseline of 2019, we look at the horizon of 2030, and we look at a number of scenarios. The first scenario is what happens if we implement the Continental Free Trade Area by 2030. What happens if we implement the Continental Free Trade Area plus regional infrastructure projects that we have on the continent? And we have some very interesting results. I think today, the road is the lion's share of freight on the continent, 77%. But if we do implement the Continental Free Trade Area, this will fall to about 69% or so. But the most interesting findings we are having is that the railway today carries just 0.3% of freight on the continent. If we implement the Continental Free Trade Area, this will move to 6.8%. And this has implications for investment in railways. What we found for air transport, for instance, is that today the share is about 1%. In 2030, that share will not change. But the most important statistics is that the volume carried by air will double from 2.5 million tons to 4.5 million tons. And what does that mean? We need a lot more aircraft to carry this increased goods by air. So basically, we also ask ourselves, what infrastructure needs upgrading? Because we find out that there are certain links that we see a substantial increase in flow of freight. And those links, we believe, will not be able to accommodate the increase in freight. And so they need upgrading. And for roads, we identify over 600,000 kilometers of roads that need upgrading. For railways, we identify more than 87,000 kilometers of railways that will need upgrading. And we can begin to put figures into this, because we know that we need about $0.5 million to $1.5 million to upgrade a kilometer of road. And if we do that mathematics, we are able to say that we need between 25 to 60 billion dollars to upgrade our road. The increase in goods as a result of the Continental Free Trade Area. I don't know how much time I do have, but we also have a very good sense of where, in terms of sub-regions of the continent, we are seeing increased traffic, and this can also guide investment decisions. For instance, for roads, we see a lot of movements within West Africa. About 39% of the trucks that we will require would be operating within West Africa. We also see a lot of movements between West and Southern Africa. For railways, we see a lot of movement within West Africa. We see a lot of movement within Southern Africa and Northern Africa as well. And I just want to begin to jump into some policy recommendations here and way forward. What we have seen is that the African Continental Free Trade Area cannot be implemented in isolation. It has to be implemented hand in hand with regional infrastructure projects, like the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. I think the good thing is that we have 69 priority projects of the PIDA. We know that it will cost $160 billion to implement the PIDA projects, which is a huge opportunity for investors. Number two is the strategies, national strategies for the African continental free trade area. I think the point we want to make is the national strategies must take into consideration infrastructure development. The good news is that our study has taken a deep dive to all African countries. So we do know for each country on the continent how many kilometers of roads have to be upgraded, how many kilometers of railways have to be upgraded, how many trucks, how many airplanes, and so on, the countries need to be able to meet the requirements of the African continental free trade area. So the ECA, we are there to support countries to mainstream infrastructure requirement into the African continental free trade area national strategy. And let me just end with these figures in terms of what we need. And I think the Executive Secretary mentioned some of them. In terms of the equipment requirement, we have calculated that we need about $340 billion dollars to invest in trucks to carry the increase in freight on the continent. We need $25 billion to invest in aircraft. We need $36 billion to invest in freight wagon for train. And we need about $4 billion to invest in vessels. So I just want to leave it there with those numbers. And altogether, that's about 411 billion worth of investment that is waiting for people who want to tap. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the authors of our research, talking us through the key highlights. 400 plus billion is not a number to be scoffed at across the value chain, shared out, creating jobs. I think your research also says as a percentage of economic output, 7%, that's a lot of busy people that can participate in the economies across the African continent. So thank you very much for sharing with us the core elements of this research that inform our discussions here today. Finally, we have a comment from Walter Mzembe, who's the chairman of the World Tourism Network for Africa, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Tourism in Zimbabwe, coming to us virtually. Could I get a signal whether he is online, lined up to talk to us? Just to remind us why we should always consider the transport economy as a synergy and a symbiosis with tourism. The two are interdependent. You can't have one without the other. It's a point we've been stressing throughout the course of the day. It doesn't seem like we have, we do have Dr. Walter Mzembe. Okay, please, over to you, sir. The virtual floor is yours. If you could just talk us through tourism, transport, and the future economy of Africa.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to make an intervention in this very important forum that has been long overdue in terms of highlighting the significance of travel and tourism going forward, and obviously enabled by the transport cluster as given in the theme. But suffice to say that I wish to share with delegates that the potential of travel and tourism is signified by its exponential growth over the last 65 years or so. In 1950, there were just 2 million arrivals, international arrivals in the world. And on the back of the aviation revolution, the global market has grown exponentially, at least up to 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic, to 1.47 billion arrivals. And therefore, I'm yet to see any sector which can challenge the bullish growth of travel and tourism. No wonder it doesn't surprise, therefore, that even the United Nations World Economic Situation Prospects 2022 report actually still situates travel and tourism as the third fastest growing sector, third only after fuels and chemicals, and displacing food to the fourth place in terms of its export contributions, and also in terms of its catalytic aspects to revive the global economies. It is a sector in 2019, just before the advent of COVID, that had registered 1.8 trillion in terms of export proceeds. But the fundamental question that I want to pose before this esteemed gathering is, why are we still participating in this huge potential as Africa, only to the extent of 5% for as long as I can remember? So 55 African destinations are sharing only a mere 5% of this huge potential and this huge performance. And the answers really as to why it is happening lie in so much of the contributions that have been made today. We are not short of good papers, good workshops, and good resolutions regarding tourism and travel. I think we are missing in action on implementation. For as long as I was Minister of Tourism, for the decade that I was, we were never short of sound policy resolutions at the United Nations, the World Tourism Organization, or within the African Union itself. Some of the speakers who have spoken, very familiar faces, but we come and repeat the same testaments year after year, and absolutely nothing happens by way of implementation. So I would basically say to you, I will table my contribution with the accredited media to this forum, and also with UNECA, who have done an excellent job of gathering us, basically to refresh memory on some of the contributions that we made when we were in service ministers. In fact, as far as 2016, when I made a comprehensive contribution to the Executive Council when it met in Mekelle in Ethiopia, specifically to highlight why tourism and why travel and tourism. But I will leave you with 4 points that I think are fundamental in terms of policy direction going forward. The first one is we need to bring back the Brand Africa project into perspective. We need to work around that. And the issue that is really making it imperative is that Africa is treated as one contiguous destination, when in fact it is a conglomeration of 55 different brands that speak in dissonance, that don't speak to the same thing. And we need basically to situate Brand Africa at the African Union and make it an imperative project that is contributed to by all the 55 national economies. The next thing that I wish really to highlight is the openness project. Anything policy perspective that speaks to the idea of opening up Africa, we should chase. And this includes visa openness. This includes opening up our destination in terms of accessibility and connectivity, many of the issues that have been spoken to and spoken about in previous sessions. The obsession with national governments on wanting to own and host national airlines, even when the economics on the ground really attests to the opposite, that we cannot all host national airlines. And therefore, we need to work on consolidations. We need to work on route sharing. We need to support the regional airlines that are already doing very well. But those without national airlines, and there was a classic example that was given by the president of Sierra Leone, that without even a national airline, you can have the entire globe in your palm, just by making sure that you open your skies, air service agreements are in place, the infrastructure is in place. You can support the arrival of many global airlines into your destination without bleeding or hemorrhaging fiscus to support unviable projects like national airlines for many of our countries. The issue around institutionalization of tourism at the African Union is fundamental. I'm happy that a former colleague is now heading tourism coupled to many other elements inside the African Union. But that's not enough. You need to go a step further and actually conceive and consummate an African tourism organization, because many of these resolutions that we make here and that we make elsewhere, that are made elsewhere under the United Nations World Tourism Organization, do not find fertile ground for implementation at the African continental level. And therefore, we will need to make sure that we resuscitate a project that we started way back, and I think it froze around 2019, of the consummation of an African or Africa travel or tourism organization with an imperative membership of all the 55 countries, but basically assist with the core business of making sure that all the enablers and facilitators of tourism are in action and they're seeking consonant altogether. But the last point that I wish to make around policy, a police code, is the aspect of connectivity. It is the game changer. It is really the revolution of our time. And we must understand that God speaks to us sometimes through force. The flip side of what has happened with the COVID pandemic is that we've been leapfrogged into the 4IR revolutionary stage by way of the pandemic itself. And what we were 2 years ago is completely different from where we are now. And we are not going back to 2 years ago. And 4IR, if it was coming in 2 decades, it is coming in 5 years. And this is why even platforms like Facebook are now called Meta, because we're in the metaverse age, but it will never substitute the physical experience, the physical visit. It will never substitute tourism facilitation in the physical, but it is here with us. And therefore, we need to work around our policies that are grouped under just one keyword, connectivity, and it is the revolution of our time. But I will end here because I know that we are the last speakers and we have to rush to the next sessions. I will table my paper with you. It's quite comprehensive, and it will speak to many of the aspects that have been dealt with today. Thank you for the opportunity to engage you.
And we thank you, Walter Mzembe, Chairman of the World Tourism Network, for just raising some salient points, reminding us what matters. And I think ultimately, you know, reiterating the point, we know what needs to be done to accelerate Agenda 2063, development on the African continent, and which sectors of the economy to tap into. We know it. The research is there. It's done. It's thorough. It's credible. The issue now is just to get it done. And I hope that from the conversations you heard here today, you can see that there's incredible potential in investing in different aspects of what we call the transport and tourism economy, the different transport modalities from rail to shipping, a lot of emphasis on air and cargo because of how it relates to travel and tourism, but certainly fixing the infrastructure at ports for the railway lines and for the roads through which a lot of goods still move across the African continent. Because if we can get all of those aspects right, we're talking about building an industry that's currently worth 160 billion to what we heard, almost $500 billion. And in it, so many jobs to be created. And we were reminded that ultimately, that's why this work is being done. For the jobs and for the opportunities that it creates for all Africans, but in particular for women who are these traders moving across borders, and young Africans who will be migrating from country to country, if not for a tourism cultural experience, but for an experience as labor, to go and work somewhere, hone in and carve out new skills. This has been the 5th African Business Forum, brought to you by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Google Global and Google Africa in particular, and also Africa 24. We want to thank all those who've collaborated with us, including at the highest levels at the African Union Commission, and also across other development finance institutions such as Afrexim Bank, the African Development Bank, and many of those that participated. May I also thank our distinguished leaders who were here, the President of Sierra Leone, the President of Botswana, and of course, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Gambia, who's still here with us. We thank you very much for your time, Your Excellency Tangara. As I adjourn the session for today, may I remind all our delegates who are physically with us here in the auditorium in Addis Ababa that lunch will be served in the banqueting hall, lunch courtesy of the UNECA. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your questions. And go out there and make Africa shine, because here it's all about the ideas for a prosperous Africa. My name is Lerato Mbele. Bye-bye.